And we're on. All right, welcome everybody back to having lunch. So for Zach and I, this is going to be the second episode we're recording today because, as we noted in the last one, we're going to try and do a bit more condensed episodes, try and fit everything within an hour, maybe hour and a half maximum, just so it's a bit more digestible. The topic that we're going to be addressing today is something pretty different. It's the idea of creating a new social currency. It's something that, for me, kind of has been floating around, in my mind for quite a while. But I never really had the impetus to like sit down and try and flesh out what the idea would be, how it would work, what problems it is addressing, what problems is it actually going to solve, what might some of the complications be. And over the past couple of weeks, I've had the chance, while at home during quarantine, to really take a bit of a deeper look at it, find some more statistics and information that maybe could back me up, and start kind of fleshing out a proposal. And I thought before I have it fully fleshed out, because I don't right now, it would be important to kind of bounce it off someone, and I couldn't think of a better person than Zach to bounce it off of. And I hope you guys will all enjoy the upcoming conversation. I think the only other note I should make is that I haven't told him anything about it yet. So he's blindly agreed to join in on this conversation. And so he, like all of you listeners, don't know anything about this idea. And I think that will only make it that much more interesting.
And we're doing this so that way, hopefully I'll be able to ask like a lot of the questions that people who are listening would have about the concept. And that way the whole thing might be like a little bit more, like palatable or easy to understand, because like I'm coming from a place right now of total ignorance about these concepts, so we'll see where we get.
Yeah, and moreover, there are likely to be questions or comments that Zach makes that I don't have a full answer to or think of an answer to on the spot, and we'll hopefully try and like flesh some of the things out, or like think through some potential issues, kind of on the fly here, which I think could be a cool experience. But with that, I'm glad and ready to jump in if you are.
Yeah, let's do it.
Cool. So the topic is the creation of a social currency, but I think we can't really talk about what that means or what it would do unless we talk about what the problems are that it's going to be addressing, and really what the predicament of our country is today. So as I mentioned a couple episodes ago, I think that late stage capitalism in America is failing. And it's failing pretty damn badly. Now, it's not failing so badly for those of us, the 30 some odd % of people who can go to college, and even for like the people who get to go to elite colleges, it's not really failing that much at all, right? Like there are pretty well-designed paths, like management consulting or law or medicine or investment banking, where like you can kind of follow a specific set of things and then make a lot of money, move to the suburbs, raise a family, and like the whole thing is going pretty well.
There's like an engineered system that's meant to benefit like a specific group of people, and it's kind of self-reinforcing. Have you ever played the card game President?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a bit like that, where it's like, so the idea behind that game is if someone wins the round, they become president, and then the next round they get to take 2 cards from the person who's in the worst position. So that way it puts the president, the top level, at a specific advantage and disadvantages the bottom level in a way that it's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Yeah, that's a really cool way of looking at it, and I think it is extremely apt. Like we are in the situation where if you're wealthy, and we'll talk about this later, but if you're in a 2-parent household where both people have college degrees, you're very likely to also go on and get a college degree and make a lot of money and have a 2-parent household and send your kids to college, and all of that is good. Whereas on the flip side, if you're from kind of a single-parent household or from parents that are less educated, you are extremely likely to also grow up and not be educated, less likely to finish high school, more likely to be, arrested, have lower income, and all these types of things. But we basically have a system where there's a pretty stacked deck, And for a whole lot of people, even though, you know, in theory, we're in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, there's a whole lot of people who are in a really bad situation. Now, you know, we could kind of run through a litany of statistics about the percent of Americans that, you know, don't have enough, you know, money for an emergency, about the percent of Americans who have tremendous amounts of debt. These are just like major problems, but I think some of the ways that we can kind of see these problems in action is actually looking at how they manifest themselves politically. So I think, you know, you can look at the emergence of like radical phenomena, like, you know, Trumpism and Bernie Sanders, which you would think would be almost unthinkable, you know, 10 to 20 years ago. And when I say radical, I don't mean to, you know, condone or really make any type of value judgment onto any of these ideologies, just that they're radical in that the styles,
It's the
and
polarization.
content.
It's moving. It's the right moving more right and the left moving more left. Where there's been an elimination of moderation in modern United States politics.
Yeah, well, that certainly is true as well. And also, there's just been the prominent political ideologies are those two in particular are radically different from what there was in the previous period of, you know, 50, 60, 70 years. So there's real polarization there, and I think the reasons for that, there's a few core reasons, and I think most of them are actually economic. And if you really look at, you know, the Trump and Sanders phenomena, a lot of them are focused on like jobs, and particularly like jobs, like manufacturing jobs, millions of which have actually disappeared over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And these are millions of jobs that were accessible to, they're blue collar jobs that are accessible to Americans of all stripes that lived in what is the Rust Belt and, you know, the industrial Midwest, the heartland of the proverbial heartland of America, jobs that don't require college degrees, but were able to bring home, you know, enough money and had enough kind of prestige that people went into this. This is where they worked, their parents worked, and where they assumed their kids would work. And then all of a sudden, you know, that's no longer the case. And these communities have kind of found themselves living in extreme poverty, dealing with the opioid crisis, and you know, now we have this political polarization. So I think, you know, what I'm going to do first is try and diagnose some of the reasons why these problems have arose, and really how capitalism has failed and has continued to fail to address them, and then we can kind of talk about the solution of the social currency. But before I jump into that, do you have any further comments or questions?
I think it can be a bit touch and go trying to like diagnose the causes of the issue, because I feel that it's complex on a cultural level, it's complex on a political level. I mean, I think generational gap plays a difference. Not that generations are a particularly good way to organize a group of people. I think moving towards the flaws in the like current solutions that are being proposed is an issue. And I'd say overall, to like kind of summarize what was just said, would be the issue that we're discussing today is that there is a self-reinforcing wealth gap, but also education gap in the United States that is advantageous to those who have access, and the people who don't are kind of hung out to dry in a way that is disheartening and unjust and unfair.
Yeah.
And it just shouldn't be. It shouldn't be true, in a quote, like in the freest country on the planet, as people like to say, which I mean, I kind of disagree with on principle, but
yeah, and I think that was a really good recap of it. And I think also this solution is going to be oriented to really fixing this problem for now, but also for the generations to come. Because I think, as we'll see in a minute when I kind of jump into the underlying issues, these are problems that are only going to get larger and larger. So I think with that, it's kind of a good segue into talking about like how did we get really into this situation. And I think the story all comes down to the concept of embedded growth obligations. So I'm going to define that because I've been really trying to avoid like just like terminology for its own sake. So let's take a look at what this means. So what an embedded growth obligation would mean, for example, in the context of
Also, is this a Benism or is this a term? Like, is this one that exists?
It's one that exists. It's actually like I'll attribute it to Eric Weinstein.
Okay.
And like I'm borrowing it right now.
Yeah.
So like just very briefly, like take a look at any of these structure, like in schools, right? If you are going to get a PhD, one professor will have 10 PhD students. So let's say like math and economics. So each Harvard professor will have economics professor will have like 10 PhD students that they advise. You know, the Harvard PhD class will be, let's say, like 40 kids. Same with the Yale one and the Princeton one and the Chicago and the Stanford, right? Those are the top 5. But basically, almost all of those kids, especially when you get to kind of more and more obscure subjects like, you know, history or English literature or whatever, they all are basically looking for ideas in academia, for jobs in academia, right? So what happens is all of the people from Harvard are going to try and get jobs at Harvard, but Harvard's only going to hire 1 or 2 of them because they only hire 1 or 2 new professors each year. So then they start moving down to like the tier 2 schools, and they're looking at Northwestern, and they're looking at WashU and whatever. And so that's
no hate like, to the people who go to Northwestern or WashU. You all
no hate.
Very intelligent, bright young people.
Yeah, sure. But so the professors at like these types of places are going to be people that got their PhDs from the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons. But then the people that go to WashU and get their PhD are, you know, they're not even gonna be looked at a place like Harvard. And really at a place like WashU, you know, maybe we'll try and hire one of our own PhD students, but someone from WashU would not get a look at Northwestern. So the WashU people end up going to teach at SLU, and basically these types of things filter down because in order for this situation to not have a crisis, there would be some type of embedded growth obligation for things to continuously grow. And this is true, you know, not only in the university system, but it also exists in, you know, management consulting or investment banking or at law firms. We'll have kind of like one partner and like 10 or so analysts. And the only way that the system doesn't fail is if there's continual growth, right? And what we saw in this country from the post World War II period into the mid 1970s was actually continuous year over year growth of real GDP, real median income, and real worker productivity, which meant that if you started off as a law firm analyst in a class of 10 people working for one partner, that law firm would grow such that they might have 3 or 4 spots for partners. And then the rest of the people could kind of go off and start their own firms or go out and do something else because there was enough growth that actually existed in the system that could kind of support these bottom-up pyramid structures. What we have had since
that's I had never I'm familiar with like all the embedded hierarchies that you've mentioned because it's something that I feel particularly people with quote like professional degrees, like a law degree, undergraduate business degree, like whatever the case may be, like people going into these pathways, like it's something that everyone contends with. But I'd never really conceptualized it that way, that in order to maintain the hierarchies must keep on growing because there's year after year, there's additional classes of analysts and I had never thought of it that way. That's fascinating.
Yeah. I think I will just continue to echo that the inspiration for much of these ideas come from Eric Weinstein and his podcast. So I think a lot of this is kind of a little bit borrowed, a little bit of my own add-ons, and then try and like making it more concise and applicable to be the background of the problem here. Because we could have a whole podcast episode about embedded growth obligations and the failure of American capitalism, but I think this is only the introduction to the solution that I'm going to kind of bring forth. But so basically, what we saw in the period from 1945 to 1973 was actually this huge success. So we had real growth. And because of that, this kind of American dream where you yet each generation is successively wealthier than their parents and grandparents and are provided with more opportunity, just happened. It simply worked, and Americans were just materially better off on the whole, from 1945 to 1973. Now, what happened in the early 70s, again, we could have an entire podcast on like what actually caused the phenomena to change. But basically, real growth stopped in the 1970s. So like from 1973 onwards, real median income in the United States has not budged. Let me just like reiterate that. The median income in the United States, adjusted for inflation, has not moved upwards in the past 50 years. At the same time, our GDP and the stock market have doubled and tripled and grown at incredibly high compound annual growth rates. And the ultimate, yeah.
So what that means to me is that wealth is getting, because median is not the same as mean. Median means the middle person, and so that just means that wealth is being concentrated in a fewer number of hands consistently year after year.
Bingo.
Fascinating. Oh my God! What the hell?
So if you look at what the Sanders
that's terrifying.
Yeah, it's terrifying. If you look at what the Sanders campaign basically ran on, and like for me, like I don't agree with all of the solutions that he put out, but he diagnosed the problem basically to perfection. Like 90% of the income and wealth is concentrated among the top like 1% of people, and like more than 50% is concentrated among the top 0.1 of 1% of people, right? The top 1% of people have like a crazy amount of the wealth, and the top 1% of people have way more than half the wealth and half the income. And the top 10% have, I think, definitely more than 90%. I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but they are crazy, right? Like Bezos and the Walton family just like have as much money as like a crazy proportion of America and
bottom
really
like 100 million or whatever.
Yeah, basically.
Like some terrifyingly large number.
Terrifyingly large. So basically what's happened is that. And so now I think what I want to do is talk a little more about why that happened. I think there's been two main drivers of what's kind of happened. So basically, right, we have the real growth kind of stopping in the 1970s. But because there are still embedded growth obligations for like public corporations, right? They still need to be grow like that. You see the stock market, right, and so the overall GDP. Yeah.
Sorry to jump in, but just to be absolutely clear on what an embedded growth obligation is, it is these self-reinforcing hierarchies that in order to sustain themselves, they have to keep on growing larger. And the American society and the American economy is the same way, right? These big companies have embedded growth obligations in them too, right? Like any big company you go to work for, General Motors, you start off as an analyst. There's 100 people in the analyst class, but only like 20 people are going to become VP, and like 5 of them are going to become managers, and 2, whatever it is. Like every company has these same embedded growth obligations, and moreover, the stock market has like kind of the same thing, right? Like if you take any finance class, there's the assumption that like things are just going to be growing something like 5% a year over year, kind of compounded for all of time, because they just have, right? That's how it happened from 1945 until 1975. And so, it was kind of assumed that would continue happening from 1975 until 2020 and beyond. But basically, because real labor productivity stopped increasing in the 1970s, the only way for companies to kind of start continuously growing their profits, right? The profits are what they're kind of required to grow, and that's ultimately what's driving the stock price. The way that they were able to grow profits were basically two main reasons, or two main ways, through trade and automation. So I guess I'll talk briefly about both of these. So trade agreements. Let's take something like NAFTA. So NAFTA was passed in the 90s, and it's actually super interesting because both Trump and Sanders came out like really harshly against agreements like NAFTA. And you might think that's very surprising, given that like agreements like NAFTA were one of the very few things that like Mitt Romney and Barack Obama agreed upon.
let me just say that one more time. In 2008, right? Like one of the only, or I guess Romney was 2012, but in McCain, Romney, and Obama, right? In 2008 and 2012, one of the very few agreements that both sides agreed on was free trade is good, right? Romney,
Which is
of
the
course, the
exact
Republican.
same agreement that the two sides, like the two
Now,
polar opposites, now disagree on.
or
Why?
they agree on, but they agree on the opposite. Wait. So
Yeah.
I'll say
Yeah.
instead,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you have Romney, Obama agree trade is good. Now you have Sanders, Trump, trade is bad, right? The reason for that is because trade is both good and bad. So let me explain how it's good and how it's bad. So in theory, an agreement like NAFTA is a positive economic boost to all of the parties that are involved in the trade agreement, right? So what NAFTA basically says is there's going to be no tariff boundaries between Canada, the United States, Mexico, and the rest of South America, right? So what that means is that now goods like, let's say, cars, for example, or air conditioning should be and can be produced in the cheapest location possible, and then consume. So a few people who produce it in the high cost location, so let's say in Detroit, are going to like lose their jobs and suffer a bit. But because the car production or air conditioner production is moved to Mexico, it's going to get so much cheaper to produce air conditioners. That amount of cost savings is going to be passed on to consumers, and their overall benefit is going to outweigh the amount that the car companies, that the people who are working on the auto line in Detroit were making. And then in theory, the people in Detroit should be compensated for the government, and everyone's made better off.
So it's the idea is sacrificing a few jobs in favor of lowering the bottom line of costs pretty ubiquitously.
Yeah, exactly. And this is
Okay.
David Ricardo's theory of competitive advantage, which is that each country should produce what they have an advantage of producing. So maybe the United States would still produce some high-tech elements of, let's say, cars.
Like chips or whatever.
So, yeah, but like the actual manufacturing of the car itself, it doesn't need to be done in Detroit. It can be done in Mexico. It would be cheaper. Everyone in the U.S. would save money, and all of those savings, some of that could go to compensate, the people who were working on the cars, and the rest of it would just be straight consumer surplus. So in pure economic theory, NAFTA is good. So it's good, but it's actually the way that it works in theory doesn't actually happen in practice. So what happens in practice is that, yes, the car companies do go and move the jobs to Mexico, and it is cheaper for them to produce them, but they do not pass on the cost savings to consumers, because why would they? The cost savings end up going to the company's bottom line because they need new avenues for profit in order to fulfill their embedded growth obligations, right? So these companies, again, are basically laying off tens of thousands of industrial workers in the US who they have to pay, let's say, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year for, moving them to Mexico, where they only have to pay $10,000 or $20,000. So they basically keep all the rest of that savings for their own bottom line so that their stock continues to grow up, because ultimately the companies are just like, their fiduciary duty is to grow their bottom line profits because they're owned by their shareholders. And then, so the companies are saving these profits, and then the government is not doing enough to redistribute money and help out the workers on the car manufacturing line. And if you notice, Trump, in like the first 30 days in his office, made a whole big thing about saving like 200 jobs at like a Carrier air conditioning manufacturing plant in like rural Indiana, where like they were going to move these jobs to Mexico. And he was like, I am going to come down your ass if you do that. And this was all to save 200 jobs. But the point was that he was actually going in and saying, wow, we took 4 million jobs out of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. We basically, Bill Clinton in the 90s, and then continuing with Bush and Obama, literally shipped out these jobs to Mexico and then China, and no one helped all these people who lost their jobs. And you can tell me that you're going to institute a job training program to teach, a bunch of 50-year-old high school graduates who've been working on, an industrial manufacturing line, teach them computer science, but I'm not actually going to believe you that that's actually going to work, right? You actually have to do a lot more. So trade agreements have stolen a lot of jobs from these places. So that's
without
like punch
the
one.
added benefit, which to my mind is probably a result of like the capitalist disorder. That's just
Well,
like, yeah. Go ahead.
Well,
go ahead.
there is a lot of added benefit. The added benefit all goes to the shareholders of Ford Motor Company and General
Yes,
Motors,
because
who,
that's
by the
the
way,
job,
happen
and
to be the wealthy
because in a
people.
capitalist economy,
Yeah,
that's what they do. You
uh,
can't even call it greed. That's just the way the system works.
yeah. So the system works that the people who are the president in the game, president, right, like the elite and the wealthy, are the ones that own Ford Motor stock. They don't know anyone that works on the auto line in Detroit. So why not ship the jobs off to Mexico and make the cars for cheaper, and then Ford gets a lot more profit, and then they get to keep the profits. So it's basically a redistribution, like something like NAFTA, basically grew the entire economic pie, right? But it took away from the people who were already worse off and gave more to the people who were already better off. So it took away, let's say, $50 from the poor, or $50,000 from the people who are poor in Michigan, but gave $100,000 to the wealthy shareholders of Ford. Now, this is a gross generalization and simplification, but this is basically what happened.
Because that's the goal of a competitive system. The goal is to win for oneself. And like even if someone is who made $1 billion, $10 billion, whatever, even if they're going to go and like donate that and like support whatever causes that they're going to support, the fact is that's going to be less beneficial than letting someone just like keep their job and like sustain their own livelihood.
Yeah, definitely true. I'm going to keep us moving forward just because.
Yes.
So think about that as like the proverbial like left hand punch to the face. So that's trade, and that's, by the way, why there was such a big like Obama tried to pass TPP, which is like a new big trade agreement, but like literally Sanders and Trump both came out against it, and the U.S. has kind of backed out of it, and then Trump has gone on and kind of renegotiated NAFTA, and it's actually something, it's pretty wild that its trade has kind of done a complete 180. From being like an issue that everyone kind of agrees upon, that it's good, to now people are all of a sudden like, oh my God, we lost all these jobs. But the right hand punch in the face, which in my view has had more effect maybe already, but will certainly have more effect moving forward, is automation. So kind of the story with automation is like much the same as with trade, right? So like companies still need to grow their profits. So whether that be their retail stores, like grocery stores, or they are car manufacturing plants, automation is a great way to save money, because imagine you used to have like 15 checkout counters at the grocery store. Well, now you could have like one checkout counter for like special services, and maybe like one person to like go around and help people if they need help, or check someone's ID to see if they're buying alcohol. But you could have 20 kiosks, make your flow through the store much faster, and have your actual upkeep costs be much lower. Same thing in factories, right? You can literally make factories, you can have really advanced robots that are just like really good at producing cars, can do them at much faster rates than humans, and they cost a lot less to do. There's no upkeep cost. There's no chance they'll get injured. They can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And automation is just another great way to filter out jobs, and drive more profits to the people who own the corporation. So again, the shareholders of Ford Motor Company, or the shareholders of like, any grocery store chain or retail chain that's kind of, McDonald's or whoever it is that's kind of moving to more self-service kiosks instead of people who are servicing you, it's a great way to just drive profit, because again, we're saying we're in the type of period where there's no real labor productivity growth, right? Like people aren't getting better at making cars. There aren't new advancements, or people aren't getting better at taking McDonald's orders. So in order for McDonald's to get more profit, because they're not getting more output per worker, what they could do is just reduce worker count and put in machines, and the car companies can do the same thing, and that will drive more profit to them. And this is going to be a massive problem as we move forward. So,
and to be abundantly clear, this doesn't mean that the people who are high up in the businesses are bad people. Because in business classes, like literally the thing that we are taught is that the number one responsibility of any public company is to the shareholders. You know, like that's their it's their job to drive up profits. It doesn't mean that the people who are in these roles are monsters who don't give a shit about others, who are just trying to line their own pockets. Like okay, maybe there might be some people like that, but there's some bad people everywhere. There's some great people everywhere. You know, it's just like the way the system is structured, and the system is broken, not the people.
Exactly. And so what I'm ultimately going to get to in a few minutes, I think it's very important to keep fleshing out these problems, but ultimately what I'm going to get to is, adding in this social currency as a way to kind of address these underlying incentive problems. But the people that work at McDonald's are incentivized to go and purchase the technology that can get rid of all their workers. So who's benefiting from this? Well, first of all, it's going to be the shareholders of McDonald's, right? The already wealthy group of people who own lots of stocks. Second of all, it's going to be like the technology companies who are going out and creating these touchpad, these touch-only kiosks that can, do ordering systems, or the people that are creating and engineering the robots, or the people who are working on the bond offering to finance the purchase of these things, right? Like and the lawyers who are structuring the merger and acquisition agreements such that companies can cut out all sorts of overhead and streamline their supply chains. It's basically the people that live on the coast that work in law and finance and technology, who are already wealthy, and who they and the people that are and the elites among them who already own the stocks are the ones that benefit from this. And it's the people who work at McDonald's or the Ford plant in Detroit who are going to be hurt by it. And the place that this is really going to the point where this is really going to start causing mass havoc in the U.S. Is actually something that like the Andrew Yang campaign was pretty focused on, and that was with truck drivers. So truck driving is an occupation that there are literally 3.5 million truck drivers in the U.S. and another 5, and mostly they're middle-aged men who do not have anything greater than high school education. And there's additional 5 million more people whose work, so whether they be working at gas stations or motels, roadside entertainment, mechanics, all of that, who basically service truck drivers. So this is 8.5 million people, which altogether would be the single largest industry in the United States, are basically going to disappear in the next 10 to 20 years with autonomous vehicles. And autonomous vehicles are in theory going to be great, right? First of all, there's going to be a lot less deaths on the road, right? Because the autonomous vehicles are not going to make mistakes. But then theoretically, it's just going to be a lot cheaper and more efficient to transport things across the country. But you tell me right now if you think that the cost of your produce or the cost of or your clothing is going to go down because the cost of trucking goes down. The answer is definitely not.
Well, to my mind, that's contrary to supply and demand, which is like a simply like just because supply. I mean, the supply will get cheaper, but the demand is going to stay the same. And since like, why would companies charge less than they're able to? It just doesn't make sense in the system. That's just not how it works. The job of the company is to charge the maximum amount that they can, provided the demand, provided that they're selling. That's the job of the company.
Yeah, exactly. You are like, prices are sticky, especially going down. So like Coke, even if it becomes so much, even if Coke could transport something from their bottling plant to your house for a fraction of what it costs now, they're not going to lower the price of a can of Coke, right? Like that's pretty clear. Like in economic practice and in theory, there's a law of sticky prices. But I mean, maybe you could argue that prices aren't going to rise as fast as they otherwise would, and we could have a whole separate conversation about inflation. But the point is, consumers will probably not benefit so much or really at all from trucking being fully automated, but the companies that are making autonomous vehicles are going to benefit immensely. The trucking companies are going to benefit immensely. The producers and distribution companies are going to benefit immensely. And when I say that the companies are going to benefit immensely, I mean their shareholders will benefit immensely, which are already the wealthy people, where the people who are actually doing, driving the trucks or working at trucker motels or trucker road stops are going to be completely shit out of luck. They're going to be
fucks. There's like no other way to put it.
They're going to be completely fucked. And again, don't go telling me you're going to go retraining 3.5 million truck drivers to be computer scientists, right? The jobs that are going to be created by the next wave of automation are going to be jobs that are accessible to people like me and you and other people who have gone to elite colleges and have these technical trainings, the people that live on the coast, the people that already have the money, but they will not be accessible jobs for the coal miners and truck drivers and their children who don't have education and don't have these types of skills, but are literally, they're like a deer in the headlights right now. We are looking at 10 to 20 years out, we're going to have just millions more people unemployed, people who are in stable jobs, right? Truck driving is the bedrock of tons of communities. It's the most popular job in many states in the United States, and it's going to be completely wiped out. And that's not to mention what's going to happen with retail workers and, that's millions and millions of more jobs. So I think, if trade was the left-hand punch, automation has been and will continue to be the kind of the knockout blow from the right hand, kind of in my view. Now, I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to run to the bathroom, and then we can kind of jump back in one.
Okay, so the point we're at right now is we've discussed the factors that have led into the elimination of low-skill jobs and the factors that are going to continue this trend to like an exponential degree, that it's like it's something that started happening, but like it's going to be basically finished by automation. And then which is just going to further the issue of like concentration of a massive amount of wealth into the hands of like a few people who were already wealthy to begin with. And that's just because of the growth of big business. And I mean, I'm sure there's other issues that tie into it, which is just like big companies buying out smaller companies and then getting bigger and other things additionally. But the general problem is the elimination of low skill labor in favor of enriching a small number of existingly wealthy people.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I think the one other thing I want to say, and it was something that was kind of touched upon at the beginning a little bit, but there's a real generational component to this. And of course, I don't think that like being a millennial it actually has any, it's obviously arbitrary designations, but I think just some statistics that I've been looking at that I think are pretty interesting to note. So kind of as I mentioned, median real wages have not grown at all since 1973. So, millennials cannot and should not expect to be making more than their parents. But the problem is that the costs of things that, millennials might need, things like education, housing, and healthcare have continued to rise much faster than inflation as a whole. So the result of this is that millennials are actually going to be the first generation in American history who are going to be less well off financially than their grandparents and grandparents. So like some interesting things to note about that are that there's going to be a combined $1.5 trillion of student debt, which is an insane number. And then if you want to look
unfathomably insane.
Insane. Yeah.
For people who like can't understand what a trillion is, it was like 1 billion seconds ago Obama was president. 1 trillion seconds ago Jesus Christ was born.
That's cool. Yeah, that's good. I like that a lot. So yeah, that number times 50%. Moreover, if you look at like real household wealth, the average millennial, I think, I'm not sure exactly what the age is at, but I think it's the average millennial at the age of like maybe 30 or 35 has a net worth of $92,000 today. Their parents had 40% more than that. And even in 2001, so when Generation X people in 2001 were when they were 30 or 35 had 40% more money than millennials do, and grandparents in 1989, right? So baby boomers, when they were at the same age of 35 on average, had even 20% more income than the average millennial does now, which is quite insane, right? Like this whole American dream of each generation getting better and better, right? We saw a 20% increase from Gen X over the boomers, and the boomers over silent and the greatest and everyone before that, was a continuous increase. And we've seen a precipitous fall for the millennial generation, right? Like the people that are baby boomers and Generation X are holding on to their positions longer and longer. You could look at any number of metrics. You could just look at university presidents who 30 years ago, their average age was, in their mid 40s, but now their average age is in their mid 60s, right? Like, that's crazy. Like, people are just holding on to power too long. And the money is not trickling down to the younger generations in the same way that it used to before. But that's a whole topic for another time. But I just think is also just like something relevant to think about, because we have a severe problem there. So now let's talk a little bit about what a social currency would be. So let's talk about it, I guess, in theory. So I want to name our social currency the Commer. So
the what?
The Commer. COMER.
Commerce.
The Commer.
Oh, Commer. Okay.
For a couple of reasons. The first one, the reason why I first thought about it was community dollar, but also it could be spelled like comer, which is the same thing as to eat in Spanish. Plus, I think there's like a little funny communism thing that's in there, like the com, whatever.
Okay,
it's like better than communism.
But let's talk idea before we talk name.
Fine. I was just kind of putting that out there as a light thing. So
I like it. Okay, yeah, I'm on board.
So the idea is the U.S. dollar is meant to go to people who create economic value, right? So if you create economic value, you get a lot of U.S. dollars. But what happens if you create social value or communal value? Well, in this country and on this planet, you get nothing.
You get personal fulfillment, but personal fulfillment doesn't put food on the table.
Exactly, which is kind of why comer, right, to eat in Spanish, is kind of an important thing, right? Like, because the personal fulfillment that you get from doing really valuable activities that don't create direct transactional economic value doesn't pay for food on the table. So to give some really good examples, I think the best one you could think of is parenting, right? If you stay home and parent a child, whether you're a mother or father or both, whatever it is, you stay home to parent a child, it's a really important societal task, right? We need people raising children and instilling them with good values and helping to educate them and all of this. But if you do that, you get nothing. You get nothing. The government considers you as nothing. You're not working at all, even though it's a really hard job to be a parent and a really important societal job. You get absolutely nothing for it. If you are a community volunteer, you get nothing for that, right? You go work at the soup kitchen, you do whatever it is you do, you don't get shit for it. So something that,
I mean, it goes deeper than that. Martin Luther King, you know, Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, like all these people, the Dalai Lama, like all these people are doing what they do because not for a fiscal reward, but like the fact is that someone who's making a positive impact on the planet deserves to be compensated probably more than the person who is running Facebook, for example.
Or at least
not a shot at Mark Zuckerberg, just the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And this is true across, like, if you work for a nonprofit, right, you might make some money, but you know that going to work for a nonprofit means you're taking a haircut in terms of, I'm going to go work for this nonprofit, and therefore I probably won't be able to buy as nice a house, as nice a car. I won't be able to go on vacation, as many vacations as the person who, goes to work for the investment bank, right? And that's just something that we're okay with as a society, but I think that's something that we should not be okay with. So I want to talk about, let's use like parenting as like the quintessential example of like a problem that a social currency could solve, and then I'll start talking about some of like the details of how it might work and the ways in which it can kind of push society forward.
And to give background on parenting, there's so many households where like it's prevalent, particularly in low-income communities, where like these days kids are kind of being parented by iPads because content is being put on some form of tablet, and they're just left there watching it because the parent has to go work, the parent has to go like earn things to put food. Like there's just nothing to be done because there's. So I think parenting is a good example.
Yeah, cool. All right, I'm glad, because if you thought it wasn't, I would have done something else. But I
But I'm
have
on
been
board.
thinking.
I'm
Cool.
on board.
So, I mean, to be totally honest, the role of parents, and really the role of women in parenting in particular, has drastically changed in the U.S. in the past few decades. Let's say since the year like 1960 as a benchmark, and a lot of that is for good reason. I think it's a really good thing that women have been able to enter the workforce and succeed and excel in basically every industry that exists. But
In my mind,
at the same
undeniably a
time,
good thing. Just good for
yeah,
people. Good for
good, yeah,
humanity. Yeah.
good for humanity. It's good optionality. Yes. That being said, I think it's important to note that there's probably something good about having a parent that can be home and take care of the children, at least in the first few years of life. I think that we can't say that it's an undeniably bad thing to have a parent home, and maybe there's something to be said for at least people having the option for either the mother or the father to stay home if they want to. But as we kind of mentioned earlier, real wages have not gone up at all, and the cost of things like housing, education, and healthcare have gone up tremendously, which means that lots of families are being forced to have both parents work full time, regardless of what their preferences are, right? So, like in
So I
my
might
view,
be jumping a little bit ahead here,
yeah.
but why not universal basic income?
Okay, so you're jumping a little bit ahead.
I'll write that down. We can come
yeah,
back to that. We
cool.
can come back
Yeah,
to that.
I'll get into that. It's like one of the good alternate solutions, I think. But you look at 1960, and less than 25% of households relied on dual income, right? Which meant that 75% of households, parents with children, were able to have at least one of the parents home taking care of the children. I think that having that optionality is a really, really good thing. That if one of the parents wants to stay home with their children, they can. It's also just like one of the things that is a uniquely meaningful experience, right? That people can spend time with their children and raise their children. I think one of like the quotes that I have heard pretty often is that no one on their deathbed is wishing that they spent more time at work and less time raising their children at home, right? Like it should not be a good thing that the number of families that are reliant on dual income has went from under 25% in 1960 to over 60% in 2020, right? Most households are reliant on a dual income in order to put food on the table. In my view, that is not a good thing, right? It's okay if some families choose that both people should work, if both people want to work. It's good that there's more optionality, but it's not good that we basically have a society where you can't make ends meet. Most people can't make ends meet with only a single income earner. And so because of that, both people have to work, and then not enough attention is being paid to raising our children. That's one claim.
Like say what you will about any given person's parents. It's better to be parented and to have structure as a child than it is to not. And that's just a fact to my mind.
Yeah, and we are talking about right now two-parent households, right? So 60% of two-parent households in America have to have are require dual incomes in order to put food on the table. Now we can start talking about a major problem, which is single-parent households in America. So again, I don't want to say that all single-parent households are. I'm not saying that they're automatically bad and all bad. This is obviously going to be generalization as all statistics are, but I'm just going to kind of read through a couple of important statistics, and then we can kind of discuss them and talk about the conclusions of what single parent households have. Yeah,
to contextualize, like, and of course neither of us, like, it's an admirable thing for a single parent to do their best and to try and and to actively be trying to like protect it. It's also just they're put into an impossible situation. So so bad it's not reflective on the parent. Bad is reflective on the situation and the outcomes.
Exactly. I couldn't have said that better. And after I finish kind of talking about the parenting thing, I'm going to talk about how kind of social currency could try and address some of the underlying issues here. So here are some statistics. I think it's kind of important to think about these. So in 1960, again, using that same base year, 88% of American children grew up in two-parent households. So the vast, vast majority. Today, that number is less than 2/3, so under 67%. That's a pretty goddamn striking statistical change in only 2 generations, right? I want you to consider
the
that
population is growing, like notably. So that's
well, mostly what this is saying is for tens of thousands of years of human history, right? Assuming there was no major pandemics or wars, as close to 100% of children were born to two-parent households, right? In almost every single society since humanity started its civilization, like people grew up and there was 2 parents and that was the situation, right? Across the world today, even the rate of two-parent households is 86%. So pretty high, much lower than probably a few hundred years ago, but right around where the US was in 1960. We are at somewhere in the 60%, right? That means over 30% of children are born into single-parent households, which is crazy, right? That number is not above 15 anywhere else in the world. So we're doubling the rest of the world, tripling where we were at in 1960, and way higher than any other society in human civilization ever was, as far as we can tell. So again, that's just something we should be a bit cautious about. But I don't think we can say that this experiment with single-parent households has really been a success. So like, for example, children from single-parent households are twice as likely to drop out of high school, 2.5 times as likely to become teen mothers, and 1.5 times as likely to become idle, which means out of work and out of school, as children with both parents, right? Those are some really scary metrics. In addition, children from one-parent families have lower GPAs, lower college admission rates, and poorer attendance records. Also, not good things. And I think really probably the scariest thing that you could say is that single-parent households typically make about 30% of the income as two-parent households, right? And a lot of that is because the single parent can't work in the types of jobs. Like a single parent couldn't be, in most cases, like a management consultant where they're traveling all the time if they have children, right? Because if you're the primary caretaker, the types of jobs you have are limited. Plus, there's the fact that a lot of single parents happen to also not have, high levels of educational attainment, and because of that are already poor in the first place. And so ultimately, the outcome of this is that 42% of children who are growing up in single-parent households are poor. And that's scary because it's only 13% across the overall population, which is also scary, but this is a number that's more than 3 times the size. So if you are born as a child in a single-parent household, you're more than 3 times as likely as other children in two-parent households to be growing up in poverty. So those are some really scary, massive statistics.
So, and there are people who would be of the perspective that, like, they just need to work harder, or like just some like statements along those lines. And to my mind, that's untrue because they're put into an impossible situation where they need to provide for themselves, but they also need to, and it's like a biological desire to do right by your children. Like that's what we want to do. And so to be put in a position where they can't must be so hard, like unbelievably, like it's just terrible. Yeah. It's like a terrible thing to think is happening on the scale that it is. Like I would have had no idea. Like these things, like this is news to me, honestly.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And I'll say kind of one more stat about parenting that's also a little bit terrifying. So we're using 1960 as the base here. You want to take a guess at what the birth rate per woman was in 1960?
What does birth rate for women mean?
Like how many children does the average woman have in her lifetime? Year 1960.
I don't know. 2?
So the answer was 3.65, which is quite high, but also healthy for growing society. What do you think it is now?
4.
1.77.
Okay, I was just throwing numbers out there.
No,
I have no idea.
You're totally good. I also was kind of shocked by these numbers, but what this is basically saying is that
Wait, so we're having, well, that's probably a good thing.
no,
Honestly, I feel like
it's not a good thing, because what it means
because
is
aren't we having population problems?
we're having population decline in the United States of America.
Yeah,
Right,
is that
because
an issue? I
that
thought it
is
was
an
bad.
issue.
I thought it was bad that population was growing too much.
So I'll explain why the population decline is very bad with like a pretty simple example. Like, think about the number of old people that there are now, right? Think about, or even think about our generation, right? Imagine if we all have one kid. How are we going to support? How is that one kid going to support 4 grandparents, right?
There's that one. Oh, facts.
And 2 parents, right? We're going to have.
I mean, the older generation does have the benefit of having Social Security, which like
it's going to run out. It's going to start running out for our parents, and it's definitely going to run out for us. But if we are all
100%, yeah, we've got no shot.
So if we have one kid, right? Who's going to pay for us? How are we going to survive, right? As a generation, because right now we are not producing enough working age people because people aren't having enough children. So we're not producing enough working age people. So there's not enough money that's going to go into the Social Security system and the tax system, and we're going to be completely fucked. In fact, the only reason why this country isn't experiencing population decline right now is because of immigration. But if you look at what's happening in Japan, or what happened in Japan and what's going to happen in China, they're going to be running into these same problems just because they flattened their population way too much. And now, because life expectancy is longer than ever before, there's just not going to be enough young, productive working people to support old people. And it's a real problem, because if you have a whole group of people who are 70s, 80s, and 90s and not working, but that you don't have enough productive people in your 20s and 30s working, then you're simply going to have massive societal issues. So I think, I don't want to say, I mean, we could continue talking about parenting problems with, parents and children in the country, but I think now is kind of the time to start turning the corner and talk about what a social currency could do. So is that something that's interesting for you? Or do you want to ask any more like questions or kind of backdrop? Because I think kind of talking about parenting, and then we can kind of apply it to nonprofit work or other types of things if you want to.
So I have like a pretty solid sense of what social currency means, but I don't think we've outright given a definition for it yet. So I think there'd be benefit in doing that. And cool. To my mind, let me say what I understand it is, and then you can maybe make tweaks.
Yeah.
But based off the description, it's just it's money, I guess, that's allotted to people for fulfilling the things that we as a society need done. And that can be parenting, that can be how far does it go? Do people who okay, so there are certain industries that I think propel culture but are financially rewarded, like art and like music.
Yeah.
And those are social industries and social like, to me, those are more of cultural impact than of economic impact. But then again, I do think like Black culture is one of America's biggest exports and is ubiquitously undervalued by by people year after year. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So okay, I will. So we will address some of those details, like art and music, because those are the types of things that I've been struggling with myself. But basically, your definition of social currency is right? It is the same as dollar currency, right? Dollar currency is allocated to those who produce direct transactional economic value. The social currency, the commerce, will be allocated to those who produce a communal and social value. So
okay. What if I am like if I'm the best parent to ever live, and like I'm going to every sports game, like parent teacher conferences, like I'm just killing it as a parent. Yep. Do I get like enough commerce to like buy like a Lamborghini?
Yeah.
How
So
many
okay.
commerce
So
do I get? And how do you qualify, you
yeah.
know?
Okay. So now we're getting into the nitty gritty details, and I'm glad to kind of walk through my thinking here. So let's talk about how it might work with parents. I think we can allocate a certain number of commerce for anybody who is the primary caretaker for children. Done. End of story. Right? Like I don't. We'll talk. We can and should talk more later about how exchange rates might work and how much money will be allocated. I don't want to put
That
an
was
exact number on it
another
right now.
question of mine. The
So
exchange rate between commerce
yeah.
and dollars.
So okay. So I want to get into
Is it
that
1 to 1?
in like. So no, I'll get into it in like 30 seconds. But first, what I'll say is I don't want to put a exact something on it right now. Basically, I want to say, we pick a number. The federal government could create like some kind of bureaucracy or administration that would set out these guidelines and say, if you are the primary parent of a children, you get the equivalent, you get 1,000 commerce a year or 10,000. Pick the number, whatever it is. That will be the number it is, and everyone who is the primary caretaker of a child will get that amount. End of story. I think that will do wonders for first of all, what that will do is that will encourage more people to have children. I think in the first place, I think a lot of people put off taking children because they're worried about it will be too hard to support them economically. They don't want to take a backseat in their careers, or they're the types of families that just wouldn't have enough money if they didn't have a dual income. So I think the government should determine an amount that would be worthwhile so that one parent can kind of stay home and take care of them. Or if you're a single parent household, maybe it wouldn't be enough to support you fully, but it would be like a good amount of money to fully take care of the child and like be an extra incentive to you. So like maybe you'd have to do some part-time work on the side, but it should be a significant amount of money.
So
and we'll talk more about how that might be decided.
So I do kind of have issue with incentivizing like being a parent earlier than one is ready, because to my mind that's unfair to kids, because someone who's born to parents who are not like ready to parent is going to suffer as a result and is going to have a hard time. And I think that's unfair to children. I think that's unfair to children, so I don't think that's necessarily like I like where the idea is coming from, but in practice, like I don't know if that's like super functional. I guess the real question is why is this like why not universal basic income?
Okay.
Why is this better?
I'll answer your first question first, and then I'll answer the second question. So the reason why okay, I'll answer actually the first question first, which was the worry about people having children too young. You can tell me, maybe I'm wrong. I don't think anyone is going to be like, oh yeah, I'll have a child. I could get a little bit more money a little earlier. Like, I don't think people are going to be going out of their way to have children if they otherwise wouldn't have, if it wasn't for this system. So that's I think something that's important.
So we just both moved inside, dealt with some technical difficulties, and it was getting a bit colder. But I think basically what I was saying was I'm not so worried that anyone is going to be having children earlier because of this money. And in terms of whether or not it should be incentivized, look, I think having a child is like a monumental decision. And what I don't want to happen is for children to be disincentivized because people are worried that they're not going to have enough income to support it, or because they're worried that it's going to put their family in devastating economic circumstances. So what I want to do is alleviate the suffering of single parent households and allow families where right now they have to have two parents working in order to support the children, to allow one of those parents to stop working and become a primary caregiver in order to not have to, worry about putting food on the table. But then I can go answer the second question if you want. But yeah.
No, I mean that's totally fair. I just was stating what I feel like could potentially be a concern.
Okay. Yeah, that's very fair. But I think I'll address your second question because now is a really good time.
Because that one I do. That's like a real question, like for me, like that I have. Like, why is this better than universal basic income? Because
Yeah.
I do believe in universal basic
Yeah.
income.
So I like UBI. I think it's good. I think that there are better schemes than UBI. Specifically, negative income tax would be a better scheme than UBI to kind of accomplish the same goal, which would basically only give only UBI for people making under a certain amount of money. I think like if we're going to do any type of UBI, it should be either a capped UBI or a negative income tax. But the reason why I think social credit is better is for this one reason. So we just talked about parenting as an example, but like now let's kind of harp back to those people that work in the industrial Midwest. They got laid off from their factory. They're producing furniture, they're producing air conditioners, they're producing cars, right? You could have them sit at home and send them a check for $1,000 a month every month. Sure, you could do that, but what I would argue is that would not give them a particularly satisfying or fulfilling existence. But instead, what you could do is say, look, it's not to anyone's competitive advantage for you to go to the factory and produce cars, right? Like it's simply going to be produced cheaper in Mexico. But there are city streets that have trash all over them. There are roads and bridges that need to be paved and built. There are community centers that need to be staffed. There are all of these societal things.
I get it.
Right. So basically what we want to tell these people is right now, going to do these types of things does not get you paid or gets you paid very little. But because it is providing community value, we are going to subsidize these professions with a significant amount of commerce, right? Or community dollars, right? So basically, and any type of nonprofit work, right? Like right now I have a decision, right? I could go work in private equity and make X amount of money, or I could go work for a nonprofit and make X minus a lot amount of money, right? But if you told me I could go work for a nonprofit and make X minus a lot of money, but I'm going to get that compensated in another form of currency, then maybe my decision calculus will be a little bit different. So I think that, and if you told me I get a universal basic income, well, if I'm going to get that either way, then why does it really matter, right?
Because I'm not saying universal basic income incentivizes doing nothing, but this idea incentivizes doing good things. So like, I actually kind of on board. So it's like if you lose your job and you want to make money, then go like make a positive impact on the world. And and that's something that people can do like regardless.
Yeah.
And like homeless people can do. It takes no training, just go spread. I actually really like this idea.
Yeah.
You got me on board now. I really like this idea.
Cool. Okay. So I think some of the logistics are really what, interests me a lot. Like the way that I kind of see it working, because you asked a few questions. So the first question is you asked about kind of the exchange rate. And what I want to say is what the U.S. government should do is say, this is legal tender, right? The commerce is now a legal tender, and every business in the country is required to accept the commerce in the same way they're required to accept a nickel or a penny as legal tender, right? Like there are a lot of businesses that might not want your coins, but they are legally required by the U.S. government to take your coins in the same way they'd be required to take the commerce. The second thing about the commerce is that I would I would just provide the option for anyone at any time to trade in one commerce for $1 US if they want, which means that the exchange rate is going to be one commerce is worth at least $1 US always, no matter what, right?
I can't speak at all to the implications of creating a new currency. Like I have no idea how that would work from like a government standpoint. Like I can't even fathom how that would work. So like, because what confers it? I mean, things have value because like we give them value. Like at this point, nothing backs up the value of a dollar besides the fact that like we have assigned value to a dollar.
Yeah.
So like, would that just work? Like, could we just print? Like.
Yeah. Well,
could we literally just print this new money and like have this and then be like, hey, this is new money. Like, go spend it.
So basically, like the Fed and the federal government as a whole in the past few weeks has just printed trillions of dollars out of nowhere. In fact, they've printed more money than the entire money supply. They've printed more money in the last month than the entire money supply that existed in the year 2007, which is insane. But
That is insane.
so they can do that if they want to. But what
Would
else?
that drive down the value of a dollar?
Well, okay. Well, theoretically, yes, it would be inflation.
Yeah, but does it count as inflation if it's a different currency?
So, okay, so I'll explain kind of the mechanism that I'm thinking for it. So first of all, I think the currency should be introduced on the blockchain, just because I think that's best practice, because I think that the US dollar will eventually go digital and be on a blockchain also, right? Eliminates all fraud, eliminates all these types of issues.
Yeah,
Other
not a
aspects,
bad idea.
yeah, other aspects of the commerce that I think are important is that they'll be tax free, right? So like you don't have to pay taxes because you're doing a social good. So jobs that work, right? So another,
So it's almost better than dollars.
well, I mean, it could be better than dollars, but maybe we're not going to give you as much. And here is the really interesting self-regulating mechanism that I've kind of thought about. Is that kind of like the Bitcoin protocol, like on the blockchain, there's a certain amount of commerce that's going to be created each year that the government maybe will create a range. Maybe they say perhaps something like, 5% of GDP, not including government spending, is going to be created in terms of, physical commerce year after year. And then people will in effect like mine commerce, or like in the same way that you'd mine Bitcoin off a blockchain, you would acquire commerce by like raising a child or doing community service, or I think there are a lot of other things that we can help society. Like for example, we could like the government of Detroit could say we are going to give a 5% commerce rebate to anyone who buys a Detroit-made car. Anyone in America buys a Detroit-made car, they get a 5% rebate in commerce. Now, the way that this works is that the governments of Detroit and every other small locality, so town and locality in the country, will bid for the right to buy commerce from the federal government, right? So the federal government says, we are going to create a pool of, let's make an easy number, right? Federal government says, we're going to create 100 billion commerce this year, right? That's what we're going to create. Not so crazy, right? They printed $4 trillion in a month. So this is, let's say there's 100 billion commerce this year.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. Detroit says, we really want to make a lot of people buy American cars. We're going to buy 1 billion commerce from the federal government for $1 billion or whatever it is, or we're going to put up a bid to try and buy commerce such that we can offer the rebate in commerce to everyone in the country for buying an American car. And then they'll all buy American cars and things will be good for business and we'll get more tax revenues and we'll use those to buy the commerce, ... The city of New York might say, we want we have trash all over the place. We're going to just incentivize homeless people we want homeless people going around picking up trash. So we're going to give out free trash bags. And if you come back at the end of the day with a full trash bag, we're going to give you 10 commerce. And hopefully homeless people will go around collecting trash from the streets and come back with commerce. And they would do that. You could think of any number. You could think of, for example, I think the prison system would benefit from this. Like right now, people in prison are basically being paid like, starvation wages to like make whatever needs to be made in the state. But like, I think we could start it off and do some type of commerce system that people in prison who are doing community service or rehabilitation work, they might not be creating direct economic value such that they'll get a lot of US dollars, but instead we can give them commerce if they're, going and doing productive things for themselves or for society. We could also think about instituting some non-mandatory but optional community service on a state, local, and federal level for anyone that turns 18 can enroll in this program and take 1 year and do national community service like they have in tons of other countries, whether that be like joining the army or doing Teach for America or joining the Peace Corps or doing whatever it is. And again, you might not be creating direct economic value, so we're not going to give you dollars, but instead we're going to give you commerce. and that's going to help you start and get like a kind of a nest egg to like move forward in your life. So those are some of the mechanics that I think about. And then in terms of the exchange rate, it's going to work with supply and demand, right? So really, if if the government of Detroit is like, we're willing to spend, $10 billion to acquire these commerce that we're going to use, then it will be, I mean, look, theoretically, they could say, the government of Detroit could say, we're going to give everyone a rebate in US dollars if you buy an American car. But I think it will be like a unique feature of the commerce that like states will have access from the federal government to this this currency that's specially marked for anyone doing anything to benefit the broader community in America.
First of all, it's surprisingly well thought out.
Oh, thank you.
Like like I don't mean surprisingly in the sense that like it is surprising that to me it's just shocking that you thought about the details so well, because that's something that like I struggle with. Like I tend not to be particularly detail oriented, and that's something that I try and work on. But like it really does sound like surprisingly feasible to my mind.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the bureaucracy that we have in the government, it would not be hard at all on the federal level to create an administration that just kind of figured out what the exact right number would be and what the right proportion would be and figured out the block. Like, it just wouldn't be that hard to do. And then it wouldn't be hard to determine, like, okay, we should give X amount of money for parents. We should give Y amount of money for, prisoners, or X amount or Z amount of money for people doing the, national community service. And then on the local level, this would make really a lot of sense and would kind of help prevent fraud. Like, let's say there's a local community that really likes, art or music or something like that, right? You can give commerce to people who, and you could have like pretty good fraud detection because it's on the ground locally. Like if you perform at a free concert in the park, right? You could get commerce from the state, or like if you have an art exhibition or something. Like whatever it is, you can figure out mechanisms to get this. And I think it's just a really good way of saying, like, it's obviously not right? The dollar is for attributing economic value. This will be for attributing value to non-economic things. And then you can spend your commerce on economic goods, but also on non-economic goods. And you can always transfer it to the government for economic goods if you want it.
So to my mind, the biggest struggles would be assigning value to different actions, and because social goods and defining social good. You know?
I would leave it up
like
to local communities, though. I would just say each local community can appoint there's community boards for basically everything. Like every local level, there's tons of people who are involved in deciding which roads should be paved and like what we should, if the school should, do this or that. One of the things they can also just work on is like figuring out this allocation. And I think the federal government can and should give like basic guidelines, and then individual communities can kind of see what they're like, oh, our parks really could use like a lot of new trees planted and can be like gardened. Like we want to incentivize people to do that. And like each locality would have some type of budget for social good that they'd get from the government. And then like you could, like I was saying, Detroit could choose to kind of purchase more if they're interested in doing like a national program to try and, get people to buy their cars.
So I would love to see this in practice. I think that would be just like a super interesting experiment. I have no idea if it would work,
Yeah, I mean, me neither, ultimately. But I think I was just kind of proposing another idea. I think no one or not enough people in this country are thinking out of the box. And we have real and severe problems. And I think when most people bring an idea to the table, it gets digested kind of in this pretty black and white way. Like, oh, it's like a left-wing idea or right-wing idea. But like I am trying to bring up a new idea that can be claimed neither by the people on the left nor by people on the right, but yet should appeal to a whole host of different people. And I think that's kind of the only way that we're going to be able to move, society forward, is by really, by thinking about kind of creative solutions to solve problems like this. Like, I haven't seen this proposed by any of the big left-wing or right-wing think tanks. Like, those places are just running years behind, and they're focused on status quo, and they're not focused on trying to come up with new and creative ideas.
Well, it does seem like that government is the only place in society where we don't approve of trial and error, where it's not okay to have an idea that fails.
Yeah.
There should be some forum for testing things.
Local level.
Because I actually I do believe that this could work. I believe that.
Yeah.
It sounds like a good idea. It sounds like, and government experiments don't need to be like a communist revolution that overthrows the government.
Yeah.
Why can't it just be why can't it just be a small community that's hey, we're going to try this idea of incentivizing social good.
Yeah.
And just see what happens. I think that would be such a big step in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, and
I think the idea of incentivizing social good is just a wonderful idea. I think it's just amazing.
Yeah. I mean, and ultimately, the only other things that I really had to kind of add on this idea that still needed to be fleshed out were more type, this would just incentivize kind of more pro bono work. It could be a great way for our country to kind of get our infrastructure, our roads and our bridges and our ports, to the forefront of the world. It could help, increase childbirth rate. It could help people, who are trying to pursue their creative dreams in art or music or in other kind of those areas, help them do that as well. And also just kind of provide a safety net and provide more fulfilling opportunities for people to pursue, where they can create high impact and then also not have to sacrifice economically for doing so. And so really the rest of the stuff I had left was kind of, talking about how we should roll this out as a beta test in, maybe one in a city, a suburban area, and a rural area, and kind of see where that test goes after, 5 or 10 years. And then, think about doing it on a more national level. And really, ultimately, the local levels and the states were meant to be laboratories for testing out new ideas. And the problem that we have in this country is that we've become this one behemoth system of 350 million people. And it's all right, now everyone is going to do this and now everyone's going to do that. And it just doesn't make sense, because people in suburban Scarsdale have much different views and values and needs than people 20 minutes away in New York City, not to mention people miles and miles away in rural Missouri. And that should be so clear, but yet we are trying to create this one system with a behemoth federal government that's in charge of everything. And in my view, kind of as I said, we need to start experimenting and doing more and more things on local levels to figure out what works and what doesn't work.
To my mind, that also is just how people figure things out. You try things and then it doesn't work. And it's okay, let's fix it a little bit and then see if that works now. And so I think the fact we can't do that probably is going to cause some real problems if we don't learn to.
Yeah. And I think when people say there's our economic and governmental system is failing, people are oh, anti-American, this or that. It's no, it's so evident that there are real issues, and we don't need to blame it on a boogeyman and we don't need to say it's all the fault of the wealthy people or it's all the fault of the people from this other country. No, there's a variety of factors. And we discussed a lot of them earlier, right? That's what we spent the first half of this podcast talking about. And then we talked about all these applicable situations, right? We went in depth into parenting, but we could talk about nonprofit work for a while. We could talk about prisoners. We could talk about 18-year-olds and creating some kind of national service program. We could talk about
environmentalism.
yeah,
You
we talk
know,
about
like
anything.
there's a slew of social issues that people are passionate about.
Yeah,
You know, you could gender divide, gender equality, racial equality. Like there's
yeah,
just so like there's so many like social issues that are prevalent that deserve that there should be some incentive that for people to address them besides like it being exclusively intrinsically motivated. Because that's
yeah.
just unfair to the people who are trying to make the world a better place. It just is truly
I
unfair.
agree.
And the question that came to my mind for like a little bit was like if this existed, then why would anyone want to like work at McDonald's? And the answer is that the whole point of this is because people aren't going to be able to work at McDonald's anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
like it really just to me it really just makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
and I think you really hit that was kind of how I was going to close, which is like as we move forward, the low skill jobs are going to continue to be automated away, right? And so we need to think of some transitory system, right? Because I think in 100 years, legitimately in 100 years, most people are not going to be working, and that's okay, right? Hopefully, if everything goes well, most people will not have to work in 100 years, and we can talk about how that will happen and what society will look. I mean, we've talked about it kind of in previous podcasts before, but we need to be thinking about what are we going to do in the next 10, 20, 30 years as millions and millions of more jobs are actively automated away? How do we create structure for these people? How do we deliver currency to these people such that they can put food on the table without, you know, disrupting all the other progress that could be happening in society? And that's ultimately the real question.
So, and I actually do think that there are people who would still want to be like a computer scientist.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
I don't think this would I think yes, people would probably prefer to have like socially impactful jobs than to have like menial jobs. But
Yeah.
like I do think like I don't think this is going to get rid of people who want to be like corporate lawyers or engineers. Like I think it's just like I don't think it's going to break down. I don't think adding additional incentive structure would break down what we have built.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think anyone is going to say like, oh, you know, I want to pick up trash on the street instead of being a corporate lawyer. I think that maybe it will be, I want to work for a nonprofit instead of being a corporate lawyer or something like those kind of changes could happen. But also there'll still be as many corporate lawyers are needed because then, right, if it then
well, just because not everyone is socially motivated.
Yeah, but this will give people a bigger social motivation, and B will give them the economic driver to like take that leap and do the thing that they're socially passionate about, and then we could see how passionate these people really are about social things.
Ben, I have to be honest. I'm actually surprised how on board I am.
I'm glad to hear.
Really good idea.
Thank you.
Like well thought out on so many different levels. Like really just impressive.
Yeah, I
really speaks
that.
to you. Like speaks to you that you took the time to like actually flesh this out. Like who I really do not know. I think anybody else who's thinking about the political system in the same way that you are, and I think that is something that's so special.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
No, I'm blown away. I'm actually blown away. Like, and I'm not just saying that. Like, I really like I could go and take this idea and talk to people about it. Like, I really love this idea.
Cool. Yeah, no, definitely spread it. I mean, I think it's something that I have been thinking about for a while. And I've been thinking about like, you know, negative income tax and universal basic income for like a while. And it was kind of cool to see it on the center stage a little bit like, you know, this year, but who knows, maybe in like 4 or 8 years, people are going to be seriously talking about doing something like this also. So I think, you know,
write a paper.
Cool. Yeah, maybe I'll
write a paper. Like I actually think that this could have legs. Like
maybe I'll write
push it. No, like genuinely, like I'm on board.
Yeah, perhaps I'll write something up. Yeah, I mean, I've been like sketching out like kind of outline, so it wouldn't be so hard to put into paper form. But honestly, one of the reasons why I was super into the idea of starting this podcast was because, kind of as I told you, like I started blogging during first semester senior year, but I ultimately recognized that talking and doing long form podcasting was a much better way for me to get my ideas out there, much faster than writing and just a lot more pleasurable. But nonetheless, I think maybe this one could be a keeper. Maybe I'll write something up about it.
This one I think warrants some writing. Like I think like the rules for life, like I thought that lent itself very well to a podcast, and I think this did too. But I also think that in order to actively like reach the people who it would need to reach in order to make a change, like it would probably need to take the form of some kind of academic paper.
Yeah. Maybe I'll write it up and see what I can do with it.
I also am curious to see like I hope people listen to this and then reach out to you and like give you more criticism, because to my mind, I really like I'm kind of on board.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is I spent most of my time thinking about like I was thinking about like how much should we be doing for this and that, and what is the bidding system going to look like, and what are the currency exchange
that
rates
kind of matters
like?
less, you know? To my mind.
It matters a little bit less. But ultimately, like I recognize, like, wait, first of all, the important thing is we should leave it up to the local communities to create like boards that can make those decisions, right? And assign those values. Like, I don't need to have a 100% complete comprehensive solution that's going to say, this is how much this should be worth, and this is how much that, like, I don't need to do that.
Because that's just not like pricing isn't static.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
So why would this need to be?
And the cool thing about this is that it can be adjusted, right? Like if it works really well and like everyone picks up all the trash, but then it turns out that like there's a whole other issue, like the beach needs to be like, we need more sand or less sand, or like there needs to be more trees now, then like we can just change the incentive and be like, oh, now trash, instead of getting you 10 combers, gets you like 8, and then like less people will do that because we're raising the price of tree, right? Like it will just kind of figure itself out.
And then you just hand out like seeds to people. You hand out like seeds and shovels and say like, hey, go plant these trees, and like bring back some kind of proof that you planted these trees, and then you
take a picture. Yeah.
I'm actually like very much on board.
Yeah.
Like
cool.
Like shocking, like shockingly on board.
Cool. Well, hopefully you'll sleep it over, and when you figure out what more flaws are,
well, yeah. I mean, I'll think about it. I'll let you know if anything comes to mind. But like, I really think this is worth like disseminating at least a little bit.
Yeah. I mean,
that's like what we're doing here. But like, I also think like I think like there would be worth in like writing an academic paper on the implications of it.
Yeah.
And kind of like floating that to people who would be like interested.
Yeah. I'll think about that as well. I'll think about writing something up and then maybe sending a draft to a professor or two or someone.
Yeah, I mean, if you want me to read anything over, of course, always send them my way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And to all the listeners and viewers, I hope you guys also think this is an interesting, compelling idea, or at the very least that the problems that are identified, that we kind of identified and talked about at the beginning, are like interesting and relevant problems, because I think they are, and it's a crucial time to kind of face them. So hopefully this provided some like different, unique insight.
Well, and that's also not to say that it wouldn't be like a logistical challenge, because of course it would be. But the fact is that like you can't figure out the logistics until it's actually being attempted somewhere, you know? Because like you can hypothesize about logistics all day long, but like you'll never know until it's actually like being worked out a little bit. So I would love to see this attempted.
Yeah, and the one more thing that I guess I'll say is, if anyone's like worried about how this would actually work, just for like frame of reference, the federal government printed in the past month and a half, again, literally they pledged to create $4 trillion in a month. Like the Fed plus the government created an unprecedented stimulus that altogether was more than 5 times the size of the entire 2008 bailout. And that has all been going down in the past month, and the world has not crashed. Plus, that's not to mention that they dropped interest rates to 0, and half of the Western world, including most of Europe, has interest rates. Europe and also Japan has negative interest rates. So there are all sorts of economic concepts that are happening that are completely bonkers and much, much more kind of outlandish than this, or at least seemingly so, that are currently happening. Like the Federal Reserve of the United States is buying corporate bonds today, and that is insane because that is completely unprecedented. So I think, our financial system has clearly way more flexibility than previously imagined. And if the people in charge, i.e. the people at the Fed and the Treasury, kind of decide they want to try something new, like purchasing corporate bonds or trying out negative interest rates or doing quantitative easing or anything else, they kind of have the ability to do so. So I think, in that respect, it's definitely not an infeasible solution.
Can I also just mention what a disgusting amount of paper $4 trillion must be? Like, what a waste.
Most of it isn't being actually printed.
I would hope not.
Yeah.
I would really hope not.
Most of it is just adding a couple zeros to Excel spreadsheets at the Fed that the banks hold. But yeah.
Psycho. That's
psycho.
That's what our money is.
That's what our money is.
It goes on a computer.
It goes on a computer, and it's literally they add zeros. Yeah, but it's crazy.
And if they can do that, why can't they just add a new currency? I'm on board.
Yeah.
I like this idea.
Yeah, cool.
This is the first this is the first time we've had one of these kind of big scope ones, and I just was fully sold. But this one I'm actually sold on.
Nice. Okay, I'm glad to hear. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, for having lunch. Hopefully this wasn't too long, even though this was a pretty dense topic. But I think we did pretty good moving through it, especially once we got to the solution stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.